This lecture focuses on slavery. And I know you read a lot about the history of slavery in your textbook. So, what I really want to focus on is something that people tend not to understand about what happened with American slavery versus slavery all around the world. So, if we think about traditional slavery, slavery had existed for thousands of years. I mean, you go back to the Bible and we talk about the Hebrew slavery, the famous Exodus from Egypt. Slavery had never been based on race. Slavery had typically been based on conquest and war. And if not war, slavery was also based on paying off a debt if you owed someone money. So the traditional sense of slavery was work for debt. And slaves ultimately, in most cases, got a chance to buy their own freedom back. Now, in a lot of different traditional Arab slavery trades, slaves were not treated as animals or treated as things. They were treated as slaves. They were treated as another class of citizen. Although they didn't have the rights to vote and they didn't have the rights to own property, they still did have limited rights. They still had to be treated somewhat like a human. When we think of slavery emerging during the South Atlantic trade, we tend to start getting this idea of Africans, that whites went over to Africa, captured blacks who they thought were inferior, brought them back to the New World and to Europe, and used them sort of as work animals. The reality of it is that the triangle trade that took place between North America, the Caribbean, South America, and Africa really was sponsored both by Europeans and by African lords, African warlords. Because in essence, the African warlords were the ones who were capturing slaves, bringing them for sale, treating them in that same traditional sense as captured prey, but then putting the ownership of those people onto white Europeans, who would then take them back to be used for manual labor. And the difference here is that there's no real belief that you can buy yourself out of slavery because there's no means of you making money. The agreement is more of buying property in order to help you with labor. Now, beyond that, the majority of slaves, most people don't realize, were brought to Brazil. Brazil becomes the most rampant slave territory in the whole world. And it's under Portugal rather than under the British government. So there's different laws that are related to slavery. But slavery will continue in Brazil for quite a long time, and the majority of the world's slaves under this new sort of chattel ownership system will go to Brazil for coffee plantations, for agriculture in the Brazilian highlands. Then when we get to North America, the majority of slaves that we have are going to go to the Caribbean. Because in the Caribbean, we're growing sugarcane. And sugarcane becomes huge because from sugarcane you get molasses. Molasses becomes the most marketable good because molasses is used to make rum. And rum is something that can be traded for lots of things. So when we think of the connection between the Caribbean slavery and, let's say, New England was a fine maker of rum, but they got their molasses from the Caribbean. The slavery that took place in the mid-Atlantic in early American history was tobacco slavery, tobacco and indigo and rice. And this type of slavery had a different character to the eventual sugar plantations of Louisiana and the cotton plantations of Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and the Deep South. And the big difference here is slavery, when it first starts in America, is following sort of that old tradition in the North American continent. It's following that tradition of work for hopefully buying yourself out of that slavery. And it's not necessarily solely based on race. You have indentured servants who sort of function as slaves, who tend to be white. And then you have this new concept of an African slave who is captured by a warlord and sold into slavery, sold into bondage. But the ultimate goal, perhaps, is to have this slave gain their freedom, or at the very least, to treat this slave as a person. Yes, you own them, or you own the right to use their services, but they themselves still have some humanity to them, and therefore the way you treat them is the way you would treat a living thing, a living person, rather than you might treat a non-entity, something you might not consider to be that important. So mid-Atlantic slavery is going to have a whole different character. In the mid-Atlantic area, most slaves, for the most part, slavery is still going to be a horrible institution, but most slaves are going to live in an environment with very few other slaves in their in the ownership of an owner. You're not going to have massive plantations like you have in the South with hundreds of slaves, with masters and uh, the chances of having these huge rebellions. Most people in the mid-Atlantic, Maryland, Virginia, they're going to own a few slaves, and those slaves might be house slaves who are simply the hired help in the house, but they're owned. So the relationship that's connected between slaves in Virginia and Maryland tend to be a familial one. And I'm not trying to overgeneralize and say that every slave in the Mid-Atlantic was treated better than every slave in the South, because you had your exceptions. But overall, the Mid-Atlantic slave system was a system more like indentured servitude. And eventually, as Maryland and Virginia, which were really the only two southern states to become industrialized, as they started having industry, blacks started working, African slaves started working in those factories. So you had somewhat of a continuation of what was going on in the North with wage labor. Now it's being filled with these Mid-Atlantic slaves in the South. And had there been time for slavery to continue, slaves would have probably taken over most industrial work in the northern part of the South, the Upper South. Now, in the Deep South, which is Georgia, Maryland, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, southern Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, you had a whole different type of slavery. And that slavery is going to come predominantly out of cotton. It's still going to be in the sugar plantations. And it tends to be in plantations where there's a lot more manual labor. So to pick tobacco and rice is not as taxing. It doesn't require as much physical labor. Not to, like I said, I'm not trying to make slavery out to be something that it wasn't. Slavery was still a horrible institution, still killed hundreds of people per day. People suffered. They were separated from their families. I mean, I'm not trying to denounce the saying that the northern slaves, the slaves in Maryland and Virginia, had a much better life than the South. I'm simply saying it was a different type of slavery, which is what you need to recognize. The slavery in the South, however, now was referred to as chattel slavery because there wasn't really that familial tie. Instead of looking at slaves as being members of the working class that happened to be owned, slaves were looked at as children. And in that sense, the master could tend to their children and treat them as if they were basically ignorant all the time. Slaves couldn't learn, slaves didn't have the ability to improve their lives, and that white people were doing them a service by taking care of them. But chattel slavery went a step further in saying they're not even human. They're subservient. They're not. Whites are superior to slaves, and therefore whites have more actual genetic power than slaves. They have more ability to learn to succeed. And in the order of thinking and sort of the Darwinian belief of the survival of the fittest, slaves genetically were inferior to whites. And because of this system, slaves are going to be treated to a level that we'll never be able to comprehend in the modern world. And when cotton becomes more of a cash crop, soon after the cotton gin and the ease of being able to pick seeds out of cotton and mass grow it and mass pick it, slavery is going to become something different. It's no longer going to be something that it's going to be a means of making money. It's going to infatuate the South so much that the South is not going to be able to get rid of slavery. Slavery is going to become so ensconced in the economics of the South that to get rid of slavery means to bankrupt the South. And as you're thinking about this, now that slaves are no longer people and that there's no real belief that they're going to be freed eventually, you have to consider that when the South gets angry about slaves, they're not getting angry because they believe that their rights are being violated. They believe that their economic livelihoods are going to be destroyed. And regardless if they believe slaves are people or not, if they believe they're equal or not, they're human or not, they know that their economic fortunes are tied to slavery. And the sad thing is that the majority of whites living in the South are poor. Most slave plantation owners make up a minority of the people. Most people don't own slaves. And as a result, these poor white farmers who should be upset that slaves are taking away their jobs are more afraid of these rebellions. So these rebellions are caused because there's larger plantations, this chattel slavery, that when slaves die, they just buy new ones. They don't have a lot of belief that slaves need to necessarily be taken care of in the same way as they were in the North, where they were treated as more members of the family. And the thing about everything I'm talking about right now, you can go to 10 different sources and talk with specific slave experts, and they can give you slightly different perspectives, and they could say some of the things that I'm bringing up are not the same findings that they have. So, in essence, the end of this conversation is it's important to look at slavery beyond just the general view that all slaves were treated the same and all slavery was done in the same way. Because there definitely was a difference. And the slavery of cotton slavery was different than the slavery that we think of throughout history.